This is part one of Neal Knox, The Gun Rights War, compiled and annotated by his son Chris Knox. Part one is labeled Credentials, and it starts with the editor's note. "If it goes bang, I like it," Neal Knox once declared in a People magazine interview. He sometimes described himself as a gun meddler. He dabbled in every type of shooting he ran across. "The only shooting game that I known for certain he never tried is biathlon." But he shot everything else. Rifle, pistol, shotgun, machine gun. It made no difference to him. Every aspect of every sort of firearm fascinated him, from how it worked to how to make it best shoot right. As a guest at the famed Knob Creek Full Auto Gathering, his host thought he was having trouble with the borrowed submachine gun since he wasn't ripping through magazines with the rest of the line as they blasted the junk car that served as a communal target. Instead, he was firing 2- and 3-shot bursts at the rock on the side of the berm, learning to control the gun and make it work for him. He was having a grand time. Neal Knox was unquestionably a good shot with a maddening approach to competition. He tended to shoot well enough to beat those around him. My brother Jeff and I experienced that trait more than once. We sometimes came close to his scores, but I can't remember either of us ever beating him at any game. Better shots than Jeff or I had same experience when he and Jim Carmichael won the 1972 Arizona Regional 1,000-yard two-man team champion near Tucson. Dad and Jim entered just to shoot with no thought of winning. It was the first time he had ever shot an NRA 1,000-yard game, and the thought of winning. Shooting the 1,000-yard game. At the time, he was shooting a lot of bench rest, and it was a fair hand at reading mirage, the visible wind that boils in the scope of far-off target. The competition included several military teams as well as the reigning national champion team, Middleton Tompkins and P.J. Wright. As he became better known for his political views than for his firearms knowledge, some folks forget that Neal Knox was first, last, and always a gun buff. But here are a few pieces to reestablish his credentials. Okay, so now we go on to the first section, which is called Chucker Partridge. January 1970, Handloader Magazine. I have to keep readjusting the book so I can pet the dog. Until a few weeks ago, I had always considered the cock pheasant as the trophy upland game bird, with ruffled grouse a close second. But that was before I hunted chuckers. The chucker's trophy status doesn't derive from the mere size, for he's about midway between a bobwhite quail and a ruffled grouse, nor does his status spring from the speed, for though he is fast, his flight is neither so quick nor so erratic as a dove. It isn't toughness to kill, for while he can take a stiff jolt of shot and keep going, he can't handle nearly as much as a high-rolling ringneck. Neither does the chucker partridge have the glorious plumage of the pheasant, though he'll not take second place to the pheasant and any other bird at the dinner table. So what makes him such a great trophy bird is the fact that you're hunting him on his own mountainous grounds. You're going to work your legs down to your knees for every shot you get. And under those conditions, getting a shot and getting him are two entirely different matters. I became acquainted with Altorius Chucker in his favorite North American habitat at the steep Rocky Mountains and cliffs along the Snake and Salmon rivers in northern Idaho. While hunting with the boys from Spear Bullets and Omark CCI, they were working on a film about hunting the snake. The filming started last year but wasn't completed, so they were going back, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to tag along. Others in the party included Ray Spear, Wally Titus, and Dave Andrews of Spear, Arlen Shaney and Elmer Inthern of CCI, Ted somebody and Guns and Ammo, John Hall of One Cartridge Company, and Kelly Roberts, owner of the Jet Boats. We took up the snake. The day before making the 55-mile run upriver from the Lewiston, named with its sister city across the river, Clarkston, Washington, for explorers Lewis and Clark, veteran mountain pilot Ray Spear flew us over the campsite in his twin-engine Cessna 310. The country is desolate and rugged-looking, but it's even more rugged than it looks. Though it sure looked mean in a few days later when Dave and I flew over the same area on our way home in a one-fan Cessna. The last half of the river trip, the half beyond a sign warning boaters against further travel, consisted of almost whitewater rapids. It's no trip for an amateur boat driver. Because the hunting area is so rough to reach and because it must be similar to their native Himalayan mountains, the country abounds with chukars. Although they're planted here only a few years ago, the birds are now so firmly entrenched that an army of hunters could never wipe them out. The birds are wily. They'll flush into 5 and 30 bird coveys like bobwhites if you're close, but getting that close takes some doing. Most of the time you see them hoofing it over to the next ridge, about like blue quail. Sit quiet while you're getting your breath, and you'll hear them gossiping across the canyons with that particular clucka that gives them their name. In fact, if you're pretty well out of sight, the chatter will convince you the chukars are all around you like ants on an anthill, and that a dozen are on the slope you just climbed, but at least 50 more, or only 40 or 50 yards further up the ridge. So you grab your shotgun, push yourself into wobbly legs, and keep climbing. The birds are always higher. I finally figured out a rule of thumb for chukar hunting in these mountains. For every 1,000 feet you'll climb, you'll get one shot. This kind of hunting demands a lightweight gun, perfectly fitted with sling swivels, since part of the time it's one-handed for yourself and one hand for your gun, and sometimes it's one-handed for yourself isn't enough, and you flush birds at the moment, all you can do is glare at them. A modified choke is about right, since most shots are fairly long, and the load should be all the number 6 shot the shell will handle. Wrapped in a pellet protector sleeve for uniform patterns, you'll have your work so hard for each shot you won't want any ammo problems, but neither do you want a load that will kick you off a ridge. Something that's almost happened to me. After you shoot your first chukar, you're probably going to have to go a long ways downhill to get them, and that's the way they usually travel, gaining a great deal of speed in the process. Your chukar will be slate gray and tan with the whitish belly. The sole distinctive marks are his striking black and white face pattern, bright red legs, and sharply defined black bars along the body. None of the pheasant's flesh, but a hand's some species if you shot him in country like the Snake River. He's a trophy bird. Next section is called What Luck, or The Editor Wins a Championship. At 6 o'clock in the morning, this is from November 1974, Handloader magazine. At 6 o'clock in the morning, any morning, I have all the energy of a bullfrog buried under 6 inches of January mud. That particular morning, the last day of the Varmint and Sporter Championship in Knoxville, was even worse than usual, for I was tired all the way through. Since leaving my work-pile desk 2 weeks before, I had flown to Ohio, shot the 4-day unrestricted bench rest rifle championship, about as poorly as usual, flown to Tennessee, shot the Sporter class, did pretty well, shot the light varmint, did terrible, and shot the 100-yard stage with the heavy varmint, which I thought I'd shot my best ever aggregate. But due to wet targets and other problems, only 2 record targets had been scored and posted by dark, perhaps because I was fretting about how those last targets had measured. I had capped the latest of those 12-hour shooting days by shooting all night, once waking up in a sweat when I dreamed I'd shot a fly on the edge of the record target. I was vaguely aware that my roommate Ellie Red Coralson had answered the wake-up call and was puttering about the room. "Better get out of that bed, champ." That had brought me awake in a hurry, but I lay there wondering if there had been cobwebs in my ears as well as my head, and wondering whether my last group, so much larger than the others on the line, could possibly have averaged such good enough to win the 100-yard heavy varmint championship, the largest event in bench rest shooting. As Red came out of the bathroom, his portable electric razor humming, asked, Didn't you hear what I called you? I heard you, but I didn't believe it. Well, you better believe it. Stan Buchel came in with the results after midnight. I figure if I woke you, you'd be worrying about the 200 yards instead of sleeping. Red may have been right, but I was so elated at that moment that I wouldn't have cared if I'd finished the last 200. While every competitor hopes that someday he'll do everything right during nationals, or more accurately, not make any bad mistakes, over the one event I never expected to win was the 100-yard heavy varmint, particularly in the sneaky shooting conditions of the East. And I certainly never expected to win the grand aggregate heavy varmint championship. For in 3 days, 3 trips to nationals, I'd never placed in the heavy varmint top 20. In fact, I've occasionally done fairly well in the other classes. I've never been among the leaders in any major heavy varmint match. But lightning struck me twice at Knoxville, and at 200 yards, I finished 13th with the .3661 MOA, minute of angle, aggregate, average 200-yard size group in inches divided by 0, or divided by 2, I guess. But when averaged with my winning .228 inch 100-yard aggregate, my .2980 aggregate was good enough to take home the Gun Digest Trophy and the National Heavy Varmint Championship patch. Now that I have something to put on it, I think I'll make a scare jacket. Within a few days, I received numerous calls and letters from fellow shooters who knew I'm no threat with a heavy varmint rifle. They wanted a story of my equipment, how it all happened, and particularly what I did differently from what I normally do. They argued Bill Minuteman, who makes the MTM cartridge boxes, was perhaps most persuasive, that a story would help the new bench competitor, help the hand loader in doping conditions during load testing, and make the non-competitor aware what the bench competition is really like, perhaps interesting him in the game, and finally let my fellow competitors know what the heck I was seeing and watching in those light, squirrely conditions at Knoxville. At first I declined, for stories such as this could have been taken as overtly bragging, which is probably it is. But knowing I'll never again have an opportunity to write such a story, I succumbed to the reporter's yen to tell it. So with an apology for boasting, in the hope that this story will do things Bill said it would, here's how it happened. The story began at the 1969 Unrestricted Bench Rifle Nationals at Mill Creek Range near Kansas City, where Ed Schillen was showing the first prototype of the DGA, which stands for Damn Good Action. Since the MBDSRA board had just adopted the rifle at its official publication, I figured I'd be getting into bench shooting for real. I ordered one, serial number 13, which indicates how well I expected to shoot it. Due to production problems, it wasn't delivered until mid-1972. Fitted with a 24-inch minimum taper, .92 at the muzzle, barrel, chambered for .222 Remington. The trigger was a slicked-up but unmodified standard Remington. The stock, which was 1/8-inch laminated walnut, had been bedded in the wood by Doug Schillen and then left rough carved in the Schillen thumbhole pattern. The morning of the 100-yard stage, the heavy varmint was foggy and rainy, with slight breaths of air fluttering the multitude of range flags in the many directions and indices as there were flags. I should say, in as many directions and intensities as there were flags. I prayed for a strong wind in such perfect conditions. Not a flag indicated enough strength to move a bullet a tenth of an inch. I habitually shot groups worse than I would in an Arizona sandstorm. I had proven in the previous day the problem was vertical. Shots with which would strike high or low or both without any apparent reason. It was no consolation that in many others were having the same problems in those innocent appearing conditions. As evidence that all bench rest groups aren't small, my average groups in the light varmint were 0.446 inches at 100 yards and 1.2 inches at the 200. As I studied the range flags before the start of the hemi-varmint class and saw only the same seemingly perfect conditions that had existed the disastrous day before, I knew I had to do something different, but I didn't know what. Much like the previous day, the prevailing condition was a light drift from the left that varied from about 4 or 5 miles an hour, dead calm. A secondary condition was when the breeze would come in from behind and slightly to the right, but the tailwind didn't seem nearly as steady as the left breeze. From sad experience, I'd learned never to shoot in a calm, since there's no telling where the shot will go and when it's avoidable. I won't shoot in headwinds or tailwinds, for both will give vertical stringing that I'm not nearly smart enough to figure out. By far the best condition was the drift from left, which I planned to shoot while it was strongest, and after it had blown across the range for at least 15 to 20 seconds, which hopefully would be long enough to get most of the flags pointing in the same general direction. When the 100-yard warm-up and match started, I fired 4 or 5 shots, which showed that the gun was shooting right to the bottom edge of its quarter-inch dot, and about a bullet hole lower and 2 holes right when the left draft was strongest. So I went to the upper right record target to settle the sandbags for that slightly higher elevation. Slipped the rifle back and forth while pressing downward against the bags, and the left condition began moving across the range. I touched off the first record shot. To my astonishment, it printed a half-inch low left. Back to the sighter. Sure enough, the shots were printing slightly lower, but in a random pattern. Much confused, I returned to the record target, and as the left condition held steadily, held just above the first hole, and rattled off the remaining 4 shots. The first 2 cut the hole, but the third outside and right edge, the lat plopped. 0.55 inch out to the left into the condition. I walked to the line convinced that either the gun was broke or that the nice little left condition was crazy. Buck at the line. An hour later, it was raining, but otherwise the same conditions existed. 2 shots on the sighter cut out the bottom of the X-ring, so I went to the record, carefully settling the gun on the bags in the new position. When the left drift appeared steadily, I confidently touched off the shot, which went high left, barely touching the X-ring at 11 o'clock. Back to the sighter. A half-dozen shots proved what I had begun to suspect. That pretty little left drift was treacherous. and making that discovery before I had been hurt allowed me to win 2 championship patches. Trouble was, though I knew one condition to avoid, I didn't know which one to shoot, and the allotted 7 minutes was rapidly ticking away. The principal option was an intermittent, puffing breeze from 5 o'clock. It wasn't strong enough and didn't last long enough to steady the flags, so I decided to ignore the flags, shooting slowly by the streamers over the firing line and the breeze I could feel on my body. Another half dozen shots on the sighter showed me that the condition was almost devoid of hated vertical and worth up to 0.3 of horizontal, depending on the angle and intensity of the breeze. With less than 2 minutes remaining, I returned to the record target. I held almost half an inch high and right of my original hold, and the shot went into the first one. By shooting rapidly and varying the hold accordingly to the breeze, I could feel the other 3 shots drilled into the group, which measured .161 in between centers. When I next went to the line, it was raining harder, but the breezes were much the same. However, after I got my first shot on the record, the winds died and I chose to wait, for I didn't like where the shots went when I returned to the sighter. As I sat erect, face turned to the right to catch the first hint of my pet trail wind, some of the others finished, and seeing me gawking down the firing line, assumed I had too. A couple told me they had nearly fainted when they looked at my single-shot group. When the range officer called 2 minutes, I had to finish the group. But my luck held. The tailwind chose that moment to come back from straight behind me in gusts. I held directly over my first shot, knowing that I should hold low to allow for the probably upward push of the tailwind, but I didn't. And as I squeezed the trigger, thought, "You're going to hate yourself in half a second." Blam! I couldn't see the shot, and thought it must have gone up into the black aiming square. Then I saw it, precisely centered on the first hole. The tailwind could be trusted. The next shot was also in, but the last 2 appeared to really open up the group, making the triangle that I had guessed a 2.5 or 0.25 to 3.0. After the last match, I finally saw it, though it still looks so big that I've remeasured it twice. The measurement was only 0.185 inch. The fact I didn't see the measurement of that group was another thing. I had a lot to do with my eventual win, for I had known it was so small I would have had the jitters. In the next match, my tailwind gave me an easy .226, but in the 4th match, fired in the mid-afternoon, it began to get a little tricky. The shot was .4 high left. After checking the sighter, I held right. The shot went out a full bucket bullet hole to the left. The rest of the shots held pretty much the same, wadded with the first, the last one edging out the bottom for a .262. As I watched Relay 2 shoot its last match, I yearned to be shooting with them, for a misty rain was falling, just enough to be seen through the scope, and used for reliable doping. But as the relay finished, the sun broke through, boiling the rain from the soaked ground and sending up streams of visible mirage. I knew our relay was in for a really tough time. But that's the breaks of the game. By the time we started shooting our final group, the ground had heated enough to send erratic wind currents racing around the wood and trenched range. They were much too strong and changeable to dope off only the wind at the firing line. I had to switch to downrange flags and mirage. My first sighter shot hit 3/4 of an inch left of aim. 4 more stitched a line to the bottom of the mothball. With trepidation, I went to the record target. My fears were justified. The second shot landed far left of the first, but huge though the group was, I now had to keep it from getting any bigger, for losing one more shot would nullify any good groups. Anyone who considers bench competition boring simply hasn't experienced it. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking, so hard I feared a tremor would set off a trigger. Yet I felt if the trigger was going to bend before it finally released. The shot cut paper between the holes. Quickly I reloaded, squeezed the rear bag to line up, and watched the speed with which the mirage was flickering, at the same time staring at the angle of flags visible to my left eye. The shot was a bit low and right, but didn't increase the size of the group. As fast as I could, I fired the last shot, holding a little more left. It cut out the remaining paper, and the group no longer looked so large. It measured .315, and I was plenty happy with it, and happy with the aggregate. When I got up from the bench, I discovered my legs were so weak I could barely stand, like the day I stepped out of a plane after being trapped in a thunderstorm. Don't tell me bench shooting is dull. Ecstatic is perhaps the best way to describe how I felt when I went to the line for the 200-yard contest next day. The pressure was off. No matter what happened, I had a 100-yard championship, and I had no expectations of winning again. So all I wanted to do was shoot respectably. That same nice little over-the-shoulder condition that had served me so well came drifting across the range, and I pounced on it, shooting a .218 inch in the warm-up. It was the best 200-yard group I'd ever shot, and it gave me delusions of grandeur. While I credit we had 100-yard warm-up for making it possible for me to win, thanks to what it taught me, the extra good 200-yard warm-up nearly proved my undoing. For I attempted to shoot it when I could feel the same tailwind long after it had shown to be unreliable. The first record group should have told me to watch more of the range, since the first shot was half an inch high and the third shot almost an inch low. But because I was holding above the first shot, the group was .625 inch. Had the wild shots come in different sequence, I would have been out of the competition. The next group was an even 1 inch, thanks to the third shot, which went almost straight up. I never figured out why. Neither did I figure out why the first shot in the third record target went low. When I chased it, I caught push from the right that made the group a 1.036. The targets were being scored and posted rapidly that day, so I knew exactly how much trouble I was in. It was looking as once again I would fail to make the top 20. The problem was that the winds had become too strong to place much reliance on what it was doing along the firing line. I had to find some reliable flags downrange. Because I was on the right end of the line at the time, during the national championship, shooters fire from different bench for each match. I was concerned by a tall 100-yard backstop at the right edge of the range we were using. When the wind came from 1 or 2 o'clock, passing over and around the berm, bullets passed through the swirls, went into strange places on the target. So the first rule to avoid a downrange wind from the right. At about 150 yards, someone had a wind indicator which showed its red side when the wind was from the right, green side when the wind was from the left. Sighter shots showed that when the streamer on that indicator wasn't clear enough to dope with, indicator hung straight down, the shot would strike low, although the mirage wasn't clear enough to dope with. It's my guess that when the far streamer died, the mirage boiled enough to create an optical displacement such as can easily seen when shooting a precision rest, showed green and at least 30 degrees of angle on its ribbon, and only when the mirage was flickering to the right, which would hopefully eliminate any nasty elevation surprise. For windage, I watched 2 flags about 30 and 70 yards. They indicated the wind was steadiest at 4 or 5 miles an hour from about 7 or 8 o'clock, with the horizontal wire centered on the X-ring. The vertical wire on the left edge of the aiming square. I hoped to build up the group at the bottom of the mothball so I wouldn't have to hold the edge of the target in the event of the full switch to the right wind. It worked. The fourth record target measured .545 inch, and the final target measured .455. When the final shot of the match went into the group, I sat back and breathed a deep sigh of relief, then took a look at the neighbors' targets. I almost fainted. The fellow on my right had a nice 3-shot cluster just below the X-ring, and 2 almost touching the bottom border of the record target. And the fellow to the right had 4 below the mothball, and 1 that had dropped completely off the record, almost touching the writing above the sight or target. Bench shooters have an explanation for such phenomenon. The great ghost of the gulch reached up and grabbed one. Since my .298 aggregate was larger than the winning scores in both the Sporter and Light Varmint, where potential records had been set in every aggregate, it didn't seem possible I could win, but each of the leaders had lost a shot at some point along the line. Ferris Pindle, who had been well ahead, lost the title when his final shot of the last match hit far left of his group, making it a 1.1. Defending champion Walt Berger lost 1 in the first record match at 200 yards that came within a whisper of making up for it. Red Cornelson won the 200 with a consistent string of little groups, and he was second in the grand, which tempered my delight at winning. For 1 stray shot at 100 yards was all that kept him from being the only 3-time national heavy varmint champion. But that's the way it goes in the ultra-fierce competition of bench shooting, where you compete with the elements, not your friends. Had any of a dozen or so leaders been able to erase 1 errant shot from their targets, they might have won by a good margin. And that's where I was so lucky. Except for those 2 strangers at 200 yards, my wild shots came at the first shot on the record target, so I was able to chase them. Though I shot some good groups, I never won a match, which proves that Paul Goschel used to say, bench matches aren't won by little groups, but by the absence of big groups.
The guys and gals of GunWebsites.com encourage you to take a CCW class every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thanks for watching GunWebsites.com.